Hello, I'm Neil Clark, and in this talk I'm going to give a brief outline of some of the ideas behind data clustering techniques. So I'm going to begin by giving a big picture of the overall aims of clustering. Then I'm going to talk about how we examine the relationships between objects in terms of distance matrices. And this will lead me on to talking about some specific algorithmic approaches to clustering. I'm going to give some specific examples for k-means clustering and hierarchical clustering. And finally, I'm going to talk about cluster validation. So once we've identified some clusters by whatever method, we want to know that the cluster is something that's real and we've not just identified a fluctuation in noise. So let's begin. So in clustering, we're going to consider collections of objects which may have multiple features or attributes. Now that sounds a little abstract, so let's give a more specific example. Here on this figure on the right, our objects are points, the little blue dots. And these points are sitting in a two-dimensional space, bounded by this rectangle. Now each one of these points, these objects, has two features. The two features are their coordinates in this two-dimensional space, so their horizontal position and their vertical position. Now in this context, the aim of clustering is to divide the points, or to segment the points into groups, such that members of a group are much more similar to each other than they are to members of other groups. So in this case, it's kind of natural. You can sort of see it with your eyes, and then we can draw it with circles, that these objects form a cluster, these objects form a cluster, and these objects form a cluster. Another way to view this clustering is to, instead of considering the features of the objects, consider the relationships between the objects. So here, for those same 50 points that I just shown you in the previous figure, I have a matrix with 50 rows and 50 columns. And each element in this matrix has a number which quantifies the similarity between each pair of objects. So this matrix here doesn't contain information about the features of our points, our objects, but it contains information about the relationships between the objects. And this is another way that you can formulate the clustering problem. So in this case, instead of drawing circles around points, we can find ways of reordering the rows and columns of our matrix to bring out three groups which look like three bright squares in this figure. Now, in this case, it's kind of simple, and we can see the clusters with our eyes. This is a luxury that we don't usually have. Usually, where the objects have in bioinformatic circles, objects have a great number of very large number of features, and it's not at all obvious how to cluster the objects. So in this case, we need an algorithmic approach, and I'm going to describe some of those in this talk. Now this notion here, the notion of similarity or dissimilarity between objects, as illustrated in this matrix image shown on the right, is fundamental to many of these algorithms. They're typically built upon some notion of the similarity between objects, and the quality of the resulting clustering analysis depends to a great deal on the specific choice of the measure of similarity between objects. So I'm going to talk next about how do we relate or measure the similarity between objects and their attributes.